Morning, everybody. This is the Community and Economic Development Committee meeting of the whole, March 18th, to discuss AO 2017-74 regarding fuel tanks and Title 21 in the port. Let's go around and introduce ourselves. We'll start with
Francis McLaughlin in the Planning Department.
Suzanne LaFrance.
Felix Rivera.
John Weddleton.
Eric Croft. Christopher Constant. Dick Train.
Forrest Dunbar.
We can go around the room.
Ann Lacy.
Dave Whitfield with Planning.
Al Hart Planning.
John Cecil Planning.
Krista Stapleton. Dan Weldon.
Stephanie Kessler.
Jim Day Airport.
Sharon Walsh.
Steve Robusto, coordinator.
Chris Escher. Sue Nolan.
Mark McCarthy, aircraft oversight.
Josh Mayow, ASIG.
Kate Blair. Tesoro. Andy Honest. Works Office.
Barbara Jones.
Jeff Shields.
Chris Sherry, Office of Economic and Community Development.
Sophia Chimambi.
Steve Road. John Loretta, Scott Christopher.
All right, thank you. So, this was introduced, then we discussed it at the Community and Economic Development Committee last week and had some good information come forward. Then there were a couple amendments. One came out from that committee and another one from Chris Constant. And we decided to have another meeting today to kind of talk about those amendments. What I'd like to do first is start with the one that came from the committee, which if you have in front of you is Assembly Members Weddleton, Demoski, Trainee, and Peterson. And this one, I believe the intent was to just clarify language. But is planning staff, Francis, do you want to discuss just briefly this first one that came from the... Sure. So I guess your sense on this and clarify it.
Right, so the Planning Department has recommended approval of an ordinance. This is an amendment just to clean up the wording. What it does is it adds the words "with notice" to the original ordinance, which is important because there's two types of administrative site plan reviews. One that requires public notification and one that does not. And adding the words "with notice" clarifies that it must be the one with notice. That's signs, mailers to the community, or mailers to the property owners within a radius of the petition site. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Any comments on that? Mr. Train?
Francis, so I got a letter here, you say you're opposed the amendment, or you're opposed to constant amendment, not this particular one that we...
Right. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments on that? Okay, so this will be, I guess, in front of us on Tuesday. But also offhand, Senator Peterson, I believe, went to the Public Works building. So I think he's coming here. He's on his way.
John, is the railroad here?
Big pardon. Is there someone here from the railroad?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
This is Chris Sherry. Jim Cubis from the Mountain Railroad. Since they're not involved in this issue, they chose not to participate today. They're just watching from the sidelines.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the amendment from Constant and Weddleton is the one that I suppose is going to be a little more lively. And what I'd like to do is, Francis wrote a memo on it. Maybe you could introduce, kind of make your key points. Then I think, Eve, you wrote a letter too, maybe highlight your points from that. And then Chris has quite a bit as kind of the author of this to discuss. And then we might be able to go back and Francis, you could talk about some of the points Chris made.
Chairman?
That work?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, can I ask something?
Yeah.
So I see on your agenda there are two additional amendments. One from you and Mr. Constant, and then one potentially from Mr. Rivera. Do we have those?
Okay, yeah, thanks. Okay, the first one we just discussed, there were two that there was some confusion on so the second two listed, they're actually the same ones. Actually.
Okay.
An earlier draft that we removed. That was put on there by accident. And Mr. Rivera chose to pull this.
Okay.
this happened.
So we just have amendment number 1 that's coming from our committee, Mr. Chairman.
That one, plus the one we're going to discuss now, which
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
thank you. Does everybody have that in front of you? This is the Constant Weddleton one. Starts off, it says any new facility first. Okay. Francis, do you want to go through your poll?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Francis McLaughlin. I represent the Planning Department. The Port Director can tell you about the importance of the Port of Anchorage to the state's economy, resiliency, and our country's national defense. My job is to work with zoning regulations, which turns out to have a huge impact on the port. The department opposes the amendment proposed by Mr. Constant because it would require a conditional use permit for new fuel storage facilities. The conditional use process takes a minimum of 4 months to complete with significant upfront costs, and there is no guarantee that an application would be approved by the Planning and Zoning Commission. This is a strong disincentive for companies within the port to make new investments at the Port of Anchorage. The Planning and Zoning Commission does not even want these applications to go before them. They want fuel storage at the port to be a permitted use like it was 15 months ago under the old code. The Port of Anchorage security area has 2 zoning districts, Marine Industrial and the Heavy Industrial District. Fuel storage was a permitted use in those 2 districts under the old code. This amendment requires a conditional use permit. Conditional use process is the wrong tool to regulate safety at the port. There are already many reviews during the building safety permit review process. Fire department, structural review, the Department of Environmental Conservation, the Coast Guard, Federal Department of Transportation, Federal OSHA, all these other agencies already, regardless of what we do with zoning, have a role in reviewing and permitting these projects using their codes. I guess a couple other points to make. One is that the conditional use process is really out of line with what other cities and communities in the Pacific Northwest do. That's one, and then I guess the last, my closing point would probably be that the ordinance that the Planning Department is proposing is already a compromise ordinance. Under the old code, all the activities within the port regarding this fuel storage were permitted by right uses. They were allowed to do it. This is a heavy industrial district. This is the purpose of this district. It was industrial use in an industrial zone. That's how it has always been. Now, the new code and this amendment proposed to make this a conditional use permit, which is has a big impact on the port, and we're only starting to learn the ripple effects of that. I brought with me a nice aerial photo of the Government Hill neighborhood and the fuel tanks that are in the vicinity. And what it shows is that the neighborhood is between 65 and 80 feet higher in elevation than the floor of the port where these fuel tanks are located. And I hope that this aerial sort of shows you that there's more than just the distance, but there's a proximity in terms of elevation because the world is not flat. And I'd be happy to answer questions. I think Mr. Weldon is going to go to the port next.
Yeah, Steve, you sent a letter and you can highlight the points there.
And I'll apologize in advance for my voice. I'm taking up the allergies, so I'll do my best to be clear. I don't want to sound like I'm preaching to the choir because I don't think there's anybody in the room who's going to deny how important the port is, not only to Anchorage but to the state. But just to give you some statistics, 95% of all the refined petroleum that comes into South Central Alaska comes in through the Port of Anchorage. 100% of the jet fuel for Joint Base Elmendorf Richardson use comes into the Port of Anchorage. Crowley, the tank farm that kicked this whole issue off, is the manager of all the fuel for the Department of Defense. We also manage somewhere between 60 to 85% of the fuel that eventually goes out to Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport. I hope you guys get a chance to hear from the reps from ASIG who manage the fuel consortium tank farm at the port for the airport this morning too. They're affected by this as well. The line crosses right through their terminal, doesn't engulf it, but goes through it. And according to the rules, if parts in, all's in. And they're, they will speak to it well. So we've affected the DOD and Ted Stevens and their ability to keep business moving and replacement going at a fairly regular rate. We are simply asking for the ability to continue to do the job that you guys are paying us all to do, which is economic development at the Port of Anchorage in the best, most efficient manner that we can, and in the safest, and in what's in the best interest of everybody's manner. I think we've been pretty good at that for at least the 10 years that I've been there, and we work very well with all of the tenants down there, and they've been pretty reasonable to deal with as well. And providing them the opportunity to keep economic development going here in the Anchorage area and as well as for the state is what we would like to see come out of this. But at the end of the day, we're municipal employees, and what the code says is what we're going to do.
Okay, thank you. So what does ASIG stand
ASIG stands for Aircraft Services International Group. ASIG is the operator for AFSC, which is Anchorage Fueling Service Company, which is owned by Alaska Airlines, Delta, UPS, FedEx, a lot of the operators coming in through the Anchorage International Airport. So we operate on their behalf, storing fuel and delivering fuel.
I think what we'll do is we'll let Mr. Constant make some of his points, and we go back to staff and Steve if they want to talk about his, but then we'll have time. Community Council has a lot of information, and then we'll give you a chance to speak for We've got a couple hours, I think we can get through.
The question for Francis, by right, you said it pertains to northwestern ports. Bellingham, Seattle, Portland, or where?
Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, Boulder, Asheville, North Carolina, Juneau, Denver, Colorado, all of these communities, I call their planning department, check their codes, and they do not require a conditional use permit as proposed by SNS.
Thank you, Francis.
Any other questions from Steve or
Yeah.
Francis?
Steve, how many tank farms have been built in the last 25 years?
In the last 25 years?
Yeah.
One.
One. Okay, one.
Do you want to go ahead?
I had a question on the Portland example, because there was one of the testifiers when we heard this brought up that Portland had limited the growth of tank farms near its residential areas, or indeed prohibited it, enforced it to other areas. Was that correct?
Yeah. Portland doesn't, it's not a moratorium. They put a stop to all new tank farms. Only the ones that are currently existing are allowed to continue. Their zoning code has nothing to do with that. The zoning codes of these towns don't require a conditional use permit. It's a permitted by right use the same way as our old code.
So they didn't do a conditional use, they did a ban.
Yeah.
I guess we can go to Steve. I think briefly, and then we'll let Mr. Constant make his points, and then we'll go back.
And I just want to qualify my answer to you, sir. It's one tank farm, which really only has one tank in it, and it's outside the 1,000 foot.
Right. Yeah. So I do have a question for Francis. We can go back to
to
this.
speak. Now's your turn. If you want to go through your amendment.
Well, yeah, first though, to the letter, it's interesting that it speaks to how there's uncertainty and there's no certainty in the conditional use process. And Francis stated in his letter that this is a duplicative process. There's nothing different in the review that would happen. But I want to make sure people understand that there is one fundamental difference, and that is the people who are most closely affected by this project would then have a voice. They would be able to speak in public about the issue to the public, and they would be heard. And so there's a fundamental difference there between all the other processes that exist. And So just want to address that specifically. Okay, so I provided a handful of documents that I have kind of dusted off out of the archives of Google and wherever I could find them, and from the memories of my neighbors. And there are 3 documents. The first one I want to start with is titled Municipality Government and Legal Challenges. So back in 1996, it comes to my attention that before the code was changed and community council couldn't sue, the governmental community council sued the city of Anchorage, the municipality. And they did so because this question was before the assembly. And it was moved by Marsh Begich, it was moved by Charles Wolford, it was moved to provide conditional use protections to the people who live in the neighborhood. And the city, of course, settled without admitting guilt. But what occurred was that the city manager and the mayor at the time, I don't know, working with the director of the economic development department or not, I don't know, but working with the board, forced, under threat of loss of job, municipal fire inspectors from speaking about their fear for the neighborhood safety. Okay, so literally it's on the record that Mayor Mystrom and George Michaelis forced a fire marshal under fear of loss of his job from being able to speak professionally or privately about the threat to the public safety. Because there wasn't enough fire suppression, there isn't enough water, there still isn't enough water. In fact, having spoken with members of the fire department who inspect that, they say their plan is if something catastrophic happens, it's to let it just burn out because that's in the end the only solution. So that's the plan. Well, Government Hill said, wait, this isn't right. So they did what they do, and they're here today continuing to do it. The names are the same. They've been doing this for nearly 30 years. They filed a Freedom of Information Act, public records request. The mayor at the time and the city manager at the time withheld public records. They don't want them having the record that they were working with the court to stop the community from being heard. Even being heard, that they were under threat, that their houses might burn, that they might die. Seems pretty reasonable to be heard. So this went to the courts. And in the end, the city settled. This is in your packet, page 2. The municipality paid $75,000 to the community council to pay for their legal expenses. And also, the first 4 pages of the settlement agreement show that while they didn't admit guilt, they implemented a First Amendment training for all of their supervisory staff because their supervisory staff were literally forcing the people not to speak about their own public safety. These people are still around today. If you're interested, you can talk to them. So in the past, we've had an administration that wasn't necessarily fair and above board. Give me a point with that. Okay. So, next I have a file that's called Active.
Just for a record, Assemblyman Peterson has arrived. Thank you.
The next file I want to walk through a little bit is active contamination sites at or around the Port of Anchorage project. So at the meeting last week, I asked the representative from Tesoro if they had any active contamination sites, assuming I would hear the answer yes. But I didn't. I heard the answer no. I was pretty surprised because I have a database report from DEC that shows there are 3 Tesoro labeled contaminated sites on the Port of Anchorage that are active right now. It doesn't mean Tesoro's spilled. It just means that Tesoro has active contamination sites. And that was my question. The point I was hoping to make was that it doesn't matter how good your operators are today. Because tomorrow, they might not be. Or something might happen. Because in the port, it's inherent that things will spill. Things happen, right? That's the nature of moving, keep the economy going. I would note, if you go to page 16, that the actual spiller for Tesoro Ocean Dock Terminal Port was Williams Tesoro, Williams before Tesoro, and also Flint Hills Resources. That's the Koch brothers. Now, what's interesting about them is they just made a settlement, and this is in your packet as well, with the state of Alaska to fully replace every single well in North Pole, Alaska, because of a plume of toxic waste that somehow showed up in their water system. Every well in North Pole, Alaska is gone. They are now being plumbed water from the city,
Happened for years.
and they won't have fresh water until 2019. So Flint Hills is actually trucking in water right now to the people who live there. And my point isn't to hammer on the companies that are doing business, because this economy is important. We've got to keep it running. My point is that people change and administrations change. And while I trust this administration and the people working there now to do their due diligent job to put forward projects that work, the proposed ordinance that I propose to amend actually puts in the hands of one individual, a political appointee, the director of planning or the director of community and economic development, to make the final red green go for a project. And they state numerous times in all of these records, the letter from Mr. Buffalo, the letter from Francis, that, well, if we have conditional use, there's no guarantee we'll get our projects. Right? Think about that. What's the implication of that? The implication is, in fact, that with an administrative site review, we will get our projects. That's the implication. And that's pretty darn scary. Because what happens there is the public doesn't actually get to testify. They're told you can submit comments via email. Right? And historically, it was the neighborhood who found out that the fire marshal was being squished and unable to talk by political forces. And it's the neighborhood who found out that there were gases leaking or demanded that smell that was pervading that neighborhood when I first moved to Alaska, that's now gone. It wasn't by the good graces of the people operating there. So ultimately, my point is that 9 people on a body appointed over many years, the Planning and Zoning Commission, who if you spend any time in the municipality, know they are not liberal bastards, environmentalists trying to stop projects from happening. They're developers that want to see this community grow. They should have an opportunity to hear the public. The public should have a voice, not just be heard by email. Now, I asked the question of Mr. Rebuffalo, how many tank farms have grown in the last 20 or 25 years? We heard 1. And it might be a few more. According to the Government Hill Community Council, there were 3 tanks built in 1993, NAPCO's expansion, 4 tanks built by Crowley, 2016, and a proposed 6-tank expansion for 2018. And with a pretty substantive increase in volume.
For the record, there are no planned tank expansions in 2018.
Okay, great. So we can take that bar off. I don't know where that information came from. Again, I'm just representing the information that was shared with me. I recognize the limitations. Some of this information is very proprietary. But the argument that this is going to put a crimp in our economy, this is going to stop the flow of our economic engine, to me, doesn't ring very true if we're talking about 1 or 2 projects over the course of 25 years. And that the public having some scrutiny in the process is actually a fair compromise, as opposed to a political appointee who could work for somebody who's willing to have the public's best interest at hand or not. And the record shows that we have had both. And so that's the gist of my point, of why I amend that we should have conditional use review for these tanks, the new tanks, that we allow the old tanks to have by right site review, administrative site review, so that we ensure that there's no threat to the public safety, that we ensure that they have the most modern equipment operating, but that for new tanks, we consider the implications and we do it publicly on the record, not privately with one individual. So that's the point that the neighborhood has helped me to understand over the last 2 weeks.
Thank you. Mr. Bosky?
Thank you. I have a variety of questions. I'll start with the question about North Pole being raised in your presentation.
Yep.
It's difficult to inject a secondary project like that when we don't have any of the basis in front of us of what actually happened in North
So
Pole.
in the document, at the back of the active contamination site, I actually included the governor's press release on the settlement that the administration is taking action to provide clean drinking water near Flint Hills because of the toxic plume, the sulfurine that happened there. I'm not.
How is that relevant though to the Port of Anchorage and the operators down there?
That the most current spill of Tesoro on their property is by the same operator who now failed, right? And even the people who are in charge of those companies today, we heard from Tuesday, didn't know that they actually had an active contamination site from the same people who have made that kind of spill.
So
That's right.
is your argument because there was some project that spilled in North Pole that we don't have the fundamental mechanical understanding, environmental understanding why it happened? Is your argument because they're that operator, we should be concerned about that operator everywhere?
No, because that operator is no longer here. My point is that things happen, unanticipated things, in your residential neighborhoods
Right.
where people
Well,
are living next to
again,
these
I'm
issues.
just trying to understand in what context that's relevant to this discussion. So, if you have a basis for, we should be concerned about this operator because, you know, out of 50 sites across the country, 50 sites are contaminated, that would be more relevant.
Again, that's not the point that I'm making. The
Okay.
point I'm making is much more subtle, I guess, and that is that it doesn't matter how much goodwill we believe comes from the operator today, right? Because administrations change and leadership changes, and so we have a duty to ensure that
I
we
can
give.
say that about everybody. Okay, so
That's
let me
absolutely true.
move on, because I'm trying to get to the context. I'm trying to get to just the facts, ma'am, as they say, right? Okay, when it comes to the political appointee, that seems like a large part of your analysis, which I think is fair to critique. But the political appointee is appointed by the assembly, or is appointed by the mayor, but confirmed by the assembly.
That's absolutely true.
Okay, so let me ask, I have a question specifically regarding administrative site plan review. Is Hal here?
I can probably
Okay.
answer that.
So, the comment was made that, and I thought it was a kind of a big leap to say that it's just a slam dunk, every single administrative plan review is gonna get approved because it's a political appointee who's making that decision. Whereas a conditional use permit may not be. Is every administrative site plan review approved?
No, and, you know, in my 11 years in the planning department, I am not aware of any case where the planning department's neutral review of a site plan and the approval criteria has been influenced by politics. Just not.
How long have you
not
been
the way
there?
we work.
How long have you been there, Frank?
11 years.
So let me ask you this. When somebody applies for an administrative site plan review, you've talked about the uncertainty in a conditional use permit review. Is there also then uncertainty in an administrative plan review, or when somebody actually gets to that phase, do they reasonably know that it's going to be approved, or is it similar to a CUP where, depending on the factors, it may or may not be?
Both of them are a discretionary review. The difference is who makes the decision. So in the case of the approval criteria for a site plan review, the decision is made by the planning director. The Planning and Zoning Commission responsible for conditional use permits.
Okay, that's fair enough. And my last question that I had just jotted down was actually a question for Tesoro, if I can ask. Is somebody here from Tesoro I'd like to ask? Could you just stand in for the record, say your name, because somebody might be listening to that.
Sure. My name's Kate Blair, and I'm Government Affairs Director with Tesoro here in Alaska.
Okay, Ms. Blair, I just wanted to go back to the assembly meeting for a minute, just to understand what I thought I remembered versus what was presented, maybe a little different than I remember. My understanding was at the assembly meeting, Tesoro was asked if they had any spill sites at the port, and the answer in my recollection was, you know, Tesoro wasn't admitting responsibility for them, but there was always stuff that happened that came up that they were constantly dealing with. Am I remembering that wrong, or what was your position? I mean, did Tesoro lie at the assembly meeting is what I'm asking.
No, so we do not have any active spill sites, and we do not have any active cleanup of any spills. There is ground contamination all across the port. There's ground contamination all across Government Hill. But we do not have any active spills, and nor has Tesoro had any spills at the port. We did acquire the Ocean Dock Terminal, to which Mr. Constant spoke, from Flint Hills just over the past year, and they acquired it from Williams. And Williams was the company before that owned not only that terminal at the port, but also the original refinery up in North Pole, where they had the contamination issues there.
Okay, thank you. That's it for me.
And just a quick point, that is an active and open contaminated site according to the state.
I mean, I'm going to go to Francis, and of course, had a question. Did you have to? Francis?
The Government Hill neighborhood is on public water lines. They're not on private wells. I'm born and raised in North Pole, and I grew up on well water. This has nothing to do with contaminated soils. It's not related. I guess that's my point. This is an industrial district, and the purpose is industrial uses. Fuel storage is one of those uses that can only go in an industrial district. Thank you.
Thanks. Forrest?
I just want to start by saying, Mr. Constant, you missed a golden opportunity to call Santa Claus a witness. I'm disappointed in you. But I have some questions about the legal language you're using for you or Mr. Weddleton. So there are two terms here. So substantive changes in C, except substantive changes. I'm wondering, is that a term of art? Is that defined somewhere in the ordinance or elsewhere in code? And the word structures as well. I mean, I think intuitively we kind of understand what that is, but I'm curious. So Tesoro wants to do work on pipelines. Are those structures as an envisioned? I mean, are they daylighting pipelines? So that's sort of my first question. The second is, when you say substantive changes have to go through, except substantive to structures existing already. Is your implication that non-substantive changes don't have to go to administrative site plan review for the prior existing? So that minor changes don't have to go through any kind of review? And I apologize, I don't have the ordinance in front of me, so I'm not sure if that is addressed elsewhere in the ordinance. But would minor changes not have to go through administrative site plan review?
So, Mr. Wilson?
Why don't you address, and then Francis, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I can help with those.
Yeah, no, and the point of using the term, it was a term of art, not a term of law, and it could use tightening. I've heard from John and a few others, and I'm happy to see it made more legally effective. And the point was to allow for safety and upgrades, even some that are pretty substantive to scale up or sideways, would be allowable under administrative site review to allow for and ensure that the operations are safe and modern and efficient. That was the intent. We might not have gotten there with the language.
Or did you want to talk on that?
No,
Okay. Francis?
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on Mr. Dunbar's question. The constant amendment is well crafted. The words in it are sound. It is written very well. The planning department would have no changes to the wording in the ordinance. It's sound. The dirty little secret is that when a building permit comes in or when a new project comes in, the planning department has to look at the zoning code and figure out where it fits into. And the word substantive change is, I spoke with the rest of our staff, and we can understand what falls into regular repair and maintenance, what falls into safety improvements, what falls into this substantive change to an existing tank, what is a new tank. There's all kinds of permutations of all of this. It's just too detailed, but I guess you just have to trust that staff is enforcing the zoning code is written, and we know how to do that.
Can I ask a quick follow-up to that, Mr. Wilson? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, if, for example, an operator wanted to replace one of their existing tanks or do repairs that were so major that they were basically a replacement, where would that fit in? Would that be a substantive change to existing, or would that be considered new, or how would that go under this?
And it depends, and it's an excellent question. So if a tank is being replaced, usually to upgrade the safety of that tank, right, then it would fall into the 50% of the value of the tank at the time of alteration or destruction or damage. And it would go through what's already in code under the grandfather rights, non-conforming rights section. It would go through a review with notice to the public and an approval criteria that they're trying to rebuild an existing tank that enjoys non-conforming rights. But very likely, the tank may be expanded in some way to cover the same amount of fluid. It may increase in size in one way or another, either up, down, some sort of footprint change. And any expansion above what the existing tank is, that falls into this category that, that substantive change to an existing tank. And so the constant amendment would allow for that to be reviewed under an administrative site plan review, whereas under current code, it would be a automatic conditional use permit. So for instance, this truck rack, which is a gas station essentially for these fuel tanks to be able to, or fuel tank trucks to be able to take fuel to J-Bear, that is an expansion of there's a project that the port wants to, or the Tesoro wants to, Crowley, I'm sorry, have this summer. It's supposed to be under construction now, but it's being delayed by all of this. That project would fall under Mr. Constant's substantive change to an existing. It would be an administrative review. So under his ordinance, only new tanks, not the changes to existing ones, would be the conditional use permit. The planning department's argument, though, is that zoning is not the right tool, based on our survey of other communities, to regulate this. It's duplicative, it's redundant, it's not the right it's a bureaucratic process that is only slightly better than a zoning variance in terms of trying to have new development at the port.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I guess on that point, so there's really three levels, with the amendment, there's really three levels. Non-substantive just happens without even a site plan review. It just happens at that lower level of automatic. They just give you notice and say, we're going to do these non-substantive changes?
There may be four subsets. One is regular repair, maintenance, and safety. And those are allowed after approval by the planning department to ensure that it's just that. 50% destruction or damage or change or alteration to an existing tank goes through an administrative process with notice under current code. Mr. Constant's amendment says that expansion of an existing tank is an administrative site plan review, and a new tank is a conditional use permit. The planning department's ordinance as written leaves out the conditional use permit, keeps it at the site plan review. And our comp plan, Anchorage 2020, policy 43 calls for these to be site plan reviews.
Great, so in effect, we have three, and he's adding a fourth on the top for the new facility.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Walton, just a quick clarification. That's not actually what's happening. What's happening here is that in 2014, Title 20 was changed. And the current status quo is, in fact, that what's required is a variance and a conditional use. That's actually what's required. I'm not adding anything. So that's what currently exists. And what I'm proposing is let's beat the plow on removing the variance, but let's leave the conditional use. And in order to ensure the safety and maintenance and the efficiency of the port, let's allow substantive upgrades to the currently existing documents. That's what I'm at, is actually to allow more efficient use of the current land. That's the only change I'm proposing.
No, I understand that compared to what the bill does, what your amendment does.
And what the status quo is today.
If I can ask, I don't know if Francis or Steve would be the best one to answer, but I think the status quo right now is what I'm hearing from the administration is that was an unintended consequence because, is that right?
That's the department's position. If you look at this is what we have now, where there's a big red swath that goes almost out to the water that makes nearly all of the fuel tanks in the port non-conforming. No new tanks can be built in that area. It's illegal to have it. It's not illegal. It's the zoning code prohibits new tanks within that area. That's the unintended consequence of the new code. Just one other point. This issue came up before in '96, as Mr. Constant pointed out, and the Assembly denied this ordinance introduced by Mr. Woolforth to make fuel storage at the port a conditional use. That was denied by the Assembly in '96. And the Planning and Zoning Commission, and I'll pass these out, their findings state there has been no evidence presented to indicate that the regulations that the state and federal agencies and the building and fire codes are not adequate to protect adjacent land uses. The bulk fuel storage operators reported the types of regulations that they must conform to. The regulations that already address these safety concerns, and the proposed ordinance and these zoning regulations are redundant. The bulk fuel storage operators advised the Commission that the bulk fuel storage in Anchorage is safe, is being continuously upgraded to the latest safety standards, and the operators have an excellent safety operation record. So the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Assembly, the previous effort to make this a conditional use failed. So I'll pass out the findings of the Planning and Zoning Commission.
Mr. Wilson? Yeah. So, my question for you, Francis, is how then did this change happen? First question. How did this change happen in California code?
That's where we don't know, but we do know that it wasn't considered the drastic impact that this would have on the Port of Anchorage.
So, okay, now, can you speak to the fact that a record exists of at least 25 years that people have been asking for conditional use protection? Right? Isn't this what this failed amendment now before us that you just presented demonstrates? That at least since 1996, 21 years ago, there has been intent and will of the members of the community to see protection put in conditional use. So what I see here is the fact that the one contiguous voice over time are these neighbors who have been asking for this protection. And so before us is an opportunity to provide that.
What Mr. Constant said is correct about the Government Hill neighborhood. The response is that the Port of Anchorage and the Planning Department, can't recall a time where they spoke to the issue of this change in the new code that places this 1,000-foot buffer separation requirement and the conditional use on the Port of Anchorage.
Any other questions?
Very briefly, can I clarify the expansion question? So for the port director, so on this, and I understand some of it's proprietary and it's predicting in the future, but you would just say the Crowley expansion happened in 16, but there's no other planned expansions. So that line should just be straight there on both.
There are no plans within the 1,000-foot buffer area. There are no planned tank constructions in 2018.
Some of it is proprietary though, so you can't, like, some of it's for competitive reasons, sometimes people wouldn't want to publicly announce that
Yes,
they're going to do that.
interest in constructing new tanks has been voiced.
Yeah.
It's all on hold, waiting the outcome of all of this.
Thanks.
Mr. Crane?
Can you get me a copy of the vote total?
Yes, but it's not automatic.
Yeah.
I wonder who voted how on the 96. Kim Tuckett, Sheila was on. Sheila showed Craig was on there. Well, she had to be voted.
She must vote total of Planning and Zoning Commission or of the Assembly's.
Was she on this or she was on this on the 96?
She was the, she wrote the memo, the Planning Department's recommendation at the time. So either she was the director to the Planning Department or her name is in this 96 packet in some role, I think, representing the Planning Department.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, just a quick one. What would happen to this if the word substantive were pulled out of this amendment?
Let's see here. So the wording is, in the I-2 district within the Port of Anchorage security area, a conditional use permit is required except changes, so it says substantive, except changes to structures existing prior. I think the word substantive clarifies this new category that's being created and keeps it in a separate sort of silo than the Chapter 12 non-conforming rights chapter that has the regular repair and maintenance and this requirement for 50% destruction and non-conforming rights, that there be public notice and administrative review. I think that Mr. Constant would want the word substantive to stay in there so that our non-conforming rights chapter stays whole and treats it this the same as it does throughout the community. And this new category, which is essentially an expansion of an existing tank, which is not allowed under grandfather rights, would also be an administrative review. I think the planning department, should this amendment be adopted, would probably want that to stay there so that it just is copacetic with the rest of the code.
All right, thank you.
Can I ask a related question?
Did you have it?
No, I was useful here.
So just carrying on with what you did, Mr. Chairman, so there's expansion though in Part B, so it says new facilities, and I think I understand what those are, or expansion of existing facilities, and that's in the part that's talking about the conditional use, the larger one. So you keep putting I'm not clear where expansion is actually. Is expansion in the conditional use permit, or is it a substantive change under the site plan review?
Okay, so we have old code, new code, our ordinance, and this amendment. And under what scenario are you asking that question?
Well, I'm just asking under, if this amendment were adopted, given that it does discuss expansion in Part B, where does an expansion go? Under site plan review or under conditional use?
Okay, so with the new code, so Part B, it's just speaking to what is bulk. Okay. So there's definition of bulk storage of hazardous materials, and then Part B says that if you any new facilities for storage or dispersion of hazardous material or expansion of them, it shall not occur within 1,000 feet of a residential district, school, hospital, or park. That's where it ended before, so that applies citywide. What the rest of the language says is that in the I-2 district within the Port of Anchorage security area, a very specific location, and the Marine Industrial District, they're exempt from that 1,000 foot.
I see. The expansion language was in the 1,000-foot buffer.
Yes.
Not in the other. Gotcha. Thank you.
That actually brings up another important concept to contemplate. So, if safety and security and all these other measures are under Title 12 or other parts of the code, then what's the rationale for simply exempting the port and not everywhere in the city? Right? Because effectively we're saying that this buffer is valuable and has a purpose, except in one place. But if in fact we're regulating all those issues under other parts of the code, then why isn't this generalized to every part of the city?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. The planning department is not considering at this time making changes to the rest of the Anchorage whole. What's at issue is the surprise that the new code presents to projects within the Port of Anchorage that alter the core function of the port and its importance to our state and national defense.
Doesn't the same apply for the airport or any other rail facility along the rail in the municipality?
Yes, but they can meet the separation distance. This is one of those, important facilities in the state, right? We've heard, mayors and important people, make that point before. Ted Stevens Airport is one of those. The port is one of those. This is an acute. We're seeing the impacts of the new code at the ports with the very first project submitted now. And this technical amendment is not trying to make a broad sweeping change back to the old code for the municipality. As I said before, it's a compromise to provide protections to the neighborhood with this administrative site plan review, but it is specifically tailored only for the Port of Anchorage, where we know we have problems.
All right, thank you. Mr. Cuny?
I could compliment that answer from Francis. One of the reasons that we're focused on the port is that we felt it required close and in-depth analysis of the implications of the unintended consequence, but also of what does it mean to do a change to resolve that issue. And rather than blanket approach across the city, because it involves not only a zoning discussion, but literally a GIS exercise to begin to draw lines and say what exactly are we dealing with, whose properties are impacted. We felt that it required a little bit more in-depth analysis on a general site-by-site basis rather than a blanket approach. One of the reasons why the railroad initially wanted to be part of this, but then stepped back because they realized too that they don't even have a full understanding of what the implications are. So that was why we chose that approach, is we really want to do it a little bit more systematically and strategically. Starting with the port was the most obvious example because of the potential for new customers, but also keep in mind that the entire distribution network for bulk fuel storage exists at the port. And if it's going to happen anywhere, new customers, new tanks, it's probably going to happen there to take advantage of that. So in our minds, it made sense to start with the port.
All right, thank you. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. I think Eric might have asked this question, but I lost the thread there of the discussion for a second. Is there any of the I-2 zone that is outside of the 1,000-foot buffer point?
No.
No.
No, I don't believe so. I mean, it's a mapping exercise, but I think that the I-2 zone almost so the I-2 zone is on your aerial map showing there's a label on it, I-2 zone administrative site plan review required. That's audit. Yeah, that's the boundary of the I-2 zone.
I asked that question because the way that C is phrased in the I-2 district in the Port of Anchorage security area, conditional use permit is required except if there were I-2 outside of that 1,000-foot, you would have actually expanded the conditional use beyond the 1,000-foot area, which I don't think is your intent, right?
You know, Mr. Dunbar, just the 1,000-foot prohibits any fuel storage at all, and therefore makes anything within that 1,000-foot non-conforming. There's different layers of this. The conditional use permit requires, the conditional use permit applies to the I-2 zone. The 1,000-foot just says you can't do fuel storage anywhere, period. That's why you've heard that Crowley has applied for a zoning variance in front of the Urban Design Commission to try and get relief from that 1,000-foot to encroach.
No, I know, but the point is that your proposed amendment gets rid of that, right?
Yes.
That proposal, but the way that this amendment is phrased, if it were to be adopted, and there were I-2 district outside of that 1,000-foot buffer, they would still have to have conditional use. But if you're saying that there's no I-2 outside of the 1,000-foot buffer, then it's
Okay.
All right, thank you. Any other points, Assembly members? We could go, Steve, do you want to make any more points based on this discussion? Any rebuttal points or?
No, Francis spoke very well on our behalf on this. But my only other concern is the fact that there are petroleum storage terminals inside the buffer and some that are outside the buffer. And the rules these rules and restrictions don't apply to those outside the buffer. And now there's an issue of competitive advantage of one company over another that is on the table.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, one quick thing, just for Francis perhaps. Generally speaking, what is the cost in terms of time and fees for a conditional use permit? And I'm sure it's dependent, but can you provide that?
I think with these types of really expensive big projects, the fee is a really small part of the cost of the project. The real issue is the time that it takes and all the upfront costs that they have to do with no guarantee that it would actually be an approved project. So that disincentivizes any new projects and new investment at the port. So the fee for a conditional use permit is $5,400. Actually, that might be the major site plan review fee. It's a few $1,000s to apply, and it's a 4-month-long process. There's no guarantee that it can be approved.
If they are proposing changes or upgrades to the tanks, the piping systems, the pumps, whatever it is, that in fact make things safer and cheaper to operate, or whatever the rationale is for it, it just seems to me that you don't want to discourage that with a bulky process. But it doesn't sound like it's really a bulky process. Time depends upon, I suspect, the amount of concern the public may have with regards to whatever.
Well, under current code, you would definitely discourage those types of safety upgrades because they may not be allowed. Any expansion of the existing tanks are all under current code. It's essentially not allowed. And that includes the safety upgrades that are in expansion. So we've got a real problem. Whether you go with the planning department's ordinance or Mr. Constant's amendment, something needs to be done. Now, under the planning department's as-written ordinance, that would be an administrative site plan review. Under Mr. Constant's amendment, that would also be a administrative site plan review. The point of departure between Mr. Constant and the department is just in terms of the new facilities.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. To address that specifically,
Well,
we can make rounds.
I'm not sure if the question was.
This is Jim Jager speaking from the recording.
For the cost difference, isn't there the variance? You have to effectively have a full plan done. So you have to have the cost of all of the planning for the project, whereas for an administrative site plan review, what level of planning do you have to have done?
Whether it be a conditional use or admin site plan review, you have to have a fully designed project. The problem is with the Title 21, the new code as written, that would require a really backwards way of trying to be able to do that. A zoning variance in front of the Urban Design Commission and then a conditional use permit. The 1,000-foot rule, does not allow any expansion or new fuel storage, including a truck rack, anywhere within that 1,000 feet from a park, a school, a residential district, and a hospital. And that 1,000 foot from the neighborhood nearly goes to the water and covers nearly all of the existing tanks, and it essentially declares them illegal. So there is a way to get there, but it's about a year process going to the zoning, applying for a zoning variance. It's very, very in doubt whether something like that would be successful.
Yeah, it seems to me that the difference in elevation provides a little bit more security from a standards point of view. The fact that there's 80 feet difference or almost from the bottom of the tanks from the ground level to the top of the floor in most instances. does that bode well with 1,000 feet? Is 1,000 feet a standard, a national standard, or an industry standard, or what is 1,000 feet setback? I mean, if you were on the same level, 1,000 feet might not be enough. Because you have the difference in elevation, it seems to me that 1,000 feet might be smaller and provide the same safety.
You make a good point about 1,000 feet doesn't seem arbitrary. It may be too little, it may be too much. It's not the appropriate, it's very restrictive. It's not, this zoning, restriction this regulation is not the right tool to regulate public safety. It should be the fire department. But yeah, I mean, it can be, it depends on the tank, if they're old ones, if they're new ones. I've heard members of the public argue that the height, the plateau that the neighborhood sits at makes them more in danger from tank fires or fires at the port, because they are at a higher elevation and we receive the smoke or the fire the way the fire travels. It's just the planning department's position is that zoning shouldn't be stepping into an industrial sanctuary and placing more restrictions on it. The industrial district should have flexibility to do an industrial to provide these industrial services. It's a really important component in the whole makeup of a city. Stop there.
Thank you.
Yeah, in my many kind of discussions with folks who are involved with this process, one person stated that, what the neighbors don't understand is we could commit eminent domain here. We could take these properties. And I was pretty surprised to hear that. But the reality is there's no taking that's going to happen because there's no money for that kind of activity. And so ultimately these folks are going to be there, right? This residential use is in fact abutting this industrial sanctuary, abutting, not separated at all. And so consideration has to be made for these folks and how they live and where they live. And to me, the one thing that they're asking for, and it's the only mechanism that the code allows, is to honor our charter, and that is to give the councils and the people a voice, and that voice is a hearing. It's not just emails. So we're not taking the property.
Thank you. So we have a lot of people here who want to speak. I think could we maybe briefly the folks from the SIG, thanks. Maybe highlight kind of your needs and your view of this, and then I don't know, Ms. Blair with Tesoro briefly, and then we'll give the committee council had some documents at our previous meeting at the assembly meeting on this. If you could, Steve, you could outline that, so kind of work our way that way. Does that hit everyone who's got some big thing? Okay, you go ahead and state your name so we have.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll keep it brief. My name is Josh Nadell. I work with ASIG. A majority of our concerns have been brought up already. Just kind of point of perspective though. We are looking at constructing a new tank. This is very initial phases, so I don't even know if it's going to truly go anywhere, but I'm developing a business case right now to add an initial tank to the back corner of our lot, which if you look at the map, kind of just crosses through there. And so there are plans for upgrades in the future. Safety upgrades.
Where is your tank on this?
So
Is it an upgrade or a new tank?
we are talking about a brand new tank. It's in this one, so if you want to, excuse me here. So we are this tank farm here, as you go swipe that way right there. Where we are looking at building is with this 90-degree angle here is filling in, putting a new back wall here to construct the tank. And the reason we're looking at doing that is for safety and insurance against having an issue with another tank. Because right now we have to have so much capacity to be able to bring in a certain size tanker safely. And right now we do have to meet that need, but if an issue were to happen with our current tanks, we want to have some insurance. As a point of perspective, the majority of our tanks were built from 1962 to 1967, so obviously there's in 1964 there was a little earthquake. All our tanks withstood that, but we just want to make sure that whatever we build is up to current construction standards due to safety. And another point of perspective, we just invested $3 million into our facilities increasing safety through automation and basically advanced gauging systems. So we are looking at doing upgrades. And as far as those upgrades and where we fall with that in future projects, I think this is just one more hurdle within that. I think the operators kind of before we try, I can speak for us, we make every effort to operate as safely as possible without any issues as far as spills, harm to the neighborhood, harm to any of our employees or anyone else. And that's one of our primary focuses is maintaining a high quality of facility that we can continue operating without having to be in the newspaper because we have a spill, we have somebody that hurt, or God forbid something happened during an earthquake.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Okay, Ms. Blair?
Yeah, sure. So again, I'm Kate Blair, Tesoro, and I think many of our concerns were voiced as well. So we support the initial amendment that came from the committee 2 weeks ago because it does provide for that public process and administrative site review for any changes that we would make. A few things that we would just bring up is that the disincentivize, it could, having a conditional use permit could disincentivize making some major upgrades for other companies. We don't have any major expansions planned, but one thing that we do have planned is we had to sign a consent decree with the state when we purchased Flint Hills assets, and through our consent decree to sell off one of our 3 terminals, that sale, that divestment has to happen within 1 year. But then also we have to make some upgrades to the terminal that we're divesting. And so we're bound by that consent decree to make those changes within the year. And now adding this conditional use permit would actually delay that. And so we would either be at fault with the state or put us in some problems with planning and zoning. And one of the other points that I've heard made, and we talk a lot at the state level about this, and that's fairness to the companies. And so what you see at the port is because of the different districts, there are some companies that may have to go through this conditional use permit because they're within that 1,000-foot buffers, and some don't. For us, because of our different terminals, one terminal would have to go through one process, and one terminal wouldn't have to go through that process. And so then we are left with the choice of, well, where do we make that investment? Is it where we know that we can get the work done that we need to get done, or do we have to go through the process? And so those are just a couple of points that I'd ask you to consider.
Can I just say something? Sure. Are those two referred to in the consent decree upgrades or new tanks?
We're not building new tanks, but we do need to make some infrastructure changes. So we're not adding any storage. That's not planned, but we do have some infrastructure changes that I'm sure our engineers could get you more information on.
And would that be
Under current regulations in the new, so the old code, everything they did was permitted use. In the new code, 1,000-foot separation, so they couldn't do this. And 2, it would require a conditional use permit, even if they could, right?
With this amendment, it would be back to site plans. It'd be an expansion, not a new.
Under both scenarios, the expansion of the existing would be an administrative site plan
Under
review.
both
Any
the
new
amendment and
tanks
the
would
bill.
be a conditional use permit.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Under both the amendment and the bill as drafted, it
Yeah.
would be a site plan. Thank you.
Okay, so.
John?
Sorry, go ahead, Pete. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what they're planning this summer wouldn't fall under regular repair and safety and maintenance? What she was just talking about doesn't fall under regular repair, safety and maintenance?
Well, it depends. I think that when I've talked with Ms. Blair, a number of their engineers, a number of their improvements would be determined to be expansions under the planning department's interpretation. Or yes, they would be expansions, even though they're safety upgrades. They're taking pipes and increasing the amount of insulation. They're bringing them above ground. They're maybe enlarging them. They're adding apparatus to existing tanks. These sort of the things that may increase the footprint of the tanks and make them lose their grandfather rights.
But they actually would increase safety? And that's part of the plan, I believe?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Walton, those would be allowed under either. Safety increases are fine under either, or efficiency.
Is that correct? Francis?
Yes. The point of difference between the ordinance as written and the constant amendment is conditional use permit for new tanks. And that conditional use obstacle is significant and will definitely put a damper on any new investment at the port.
Okay, so I'm going to give the chance for the committee council to speak. So, Steve, you want to state your name and?
I have a handout here. So my name is Steve German. I live in Government Hill, and I'm with the Community Council. This is a good place to stand.
Somewhere, you can't really move because it gets quiet in the back. After he's done.
Since I'm very protective of your furniture in here, that I would recommend that you come around and sit if you need to be up front, as Mr. Weddleton knows.
Okay, I'd like to go over just 2 pages of this handout. You got 2 handouts, a colorful one and then this thicker one here. If we could just turn to page 6 and then 7. So on page 6, it takes a look at the cumulative effects of industrial development in the port on the neighborhood of Government Hill. The first picture you see on the left there, that's in 1915. You can see the houses on the top of the bluff. This is where Anchorage was beginning to grow and figure out what's going to be as a big city when it grows up. In the 1940s, you can see the neighborhood was fully established. So there were residents on every block. Every lot was occupied. And you just had the beginnings of hazardous storage in the port. You can see those tanks there. And the circles around them relate to zones of hazard. And many of you have seen this documentation here that are in the prior sections that describe those distances. So you've got the homes fully developed. You've got the industrial development beginning. And then in the 1960s, there was a very aggressive push after the earthquake to build and make Anchorage the regional hub for fuel storage. And so they actually encouraged the operators to come here and disincentivized growing at Whittier and at Seward, where the tank farms were damaged by the quake. This was also the time when we had our first fires, fire at Standard Oil, and some of the homes were evacuated on the Government Hill as a result of that. And in the 1920s, when the Williams brothers had a major operation down there, we had a series of fires at the tank racks and in the tanks and the loading racks. So the accident summary is for the 20 years, 1960 to 1980, there were 27 recorded spills, and at Defense Fuels, a 1 million gallon spill and 1 worker fatality. And in the next 20 years, 63 recorded spills and accidents. So all you have to do is remember the Space Shuttle Challenger, and Columbia, the ransomware hack last week. Technology does fail on occasion. There were leaks at the North Pole refinery. There are explosion fires on the North Slope. We are not immune from those industrial accidents here in Anchorage. My first page. Second page. What does it look like today? If we start at the bottom, you can see in 2017, there's 85 storage tanks. Actually, we heard this morning there's not 150, but 200 million gallons of fuel stored down there. It's very difficult for a neighborhood to keep up on this. There's no databases that we can pull. 7 rail, truck, and marine loading facilities. A very large industrial operation with zones of injury and fatality pushed into the neighborhood. Now, why do I say that? In 2002, the Worse administration, a very conservative administration, commissioned the hazard study because of the prior, what you've heard today, the prior history. And what they determined, what they found was, according to the science and technology that we have available, that the red line here, if there was a fire down in the port in one of those tanks, that's where there would be fatalities. And in the yellow line, that's where there'd be zones of injury. And then in 2016, when the Crowley expansion happened, they also did a hazard study. And they said, given a fire in their facility there, the bluff would catch on fire because it's so close due to the radiant heat transfer. And of course, the homes then are right next to them. And then in 2015, there was a evacuation table talk exercise with the city, and this whole area outlined in black would be subject to evacuation. So how did we get to this point? It was incremental development, one at a time, not looking at the whole. And the zones of separation are based on firefighting to get equipment through, not based on occupant safety. Historically, people were doing the right thing. All these people need jobs. A lot of them worked at the port. But they realized today we would not zone two incompatible uses so adjacent to each other. We're living with that historical artifact. Now, we're not the only city dealing with this. There are many others that are wrestling with this. It's a very difficult question. And in fact, the National Fire Protection Association, who set a lot of these standards, have been getting a lot of heat for this. And so this is a study that was commissioned just 2 years ago. Let me just read this. It says, many of the NFPA codes and standards, in particular the hazardous materials code, specifying separation distances for hazardous storage materials and other equipment in occupied buildings. Many of these requirements have historical, undocumented origins. Guidance, which may inform a sound technical basis for adjusting these distances, has been requested by the NFPA Technical Committee. So they are wrestling with this question right now because of Portland, because of Mobile, Alabama, because of Coos Bay, Oregon, because of Anchorage, Alaska. So what the neighborhood is requesting is at least cap the risk where it exists today. Don't allow these zones to push further into the neighborhood. Question?
Any questions? Mr. Dunbar?
No, I think that's it.
I think the neighborhood is asking for something less than that at this time, right? What I have heard is that the neighborhood is,
Yes,
folks in the neighborhood are willing to concede that misuse is happening and what they really want is safety and a voice. And so what I heard you just say is you want to see the port stop.
No, absolutely not. We want safety upgrades. We want everybody. We don't want to push anybody out. We would just like to cap the risk at today's level. We have these zones, documented zones from the city of fatality. Just don't make that creep any further. Go one more block or one more street.
I was just going to say, just following up, what I'm hearing you say is we don't want any more tanks built down there. You're saying cap it. So is that what that means?
No, there's room. I don't know whether it's 1,000 feet, like the geometry. I don't know what's 500 feet, but I'd like some science to be able to talk to these neighbors and say, your house is not impaired by this development.
Let me understand what you're saying, because I'm not so focused on your geography. I'm focused on what you're saying. You're saying when you say cap it, you're actually saying have a buffer zone. You're not saying cap it as far as no more tanks. I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, it's either one or the other.
Sure. I would say a performance-based spec or ordinance that says that these lines won't move any further into the neighborhood. That seems reasonable for a neighborhood to ask. Now, whether that's a buffer, I think a conditional use would be able to satisfy that, because we could have a public hearing and we could discuss the math, we could discuss the new movement in NFPA on what really should be required for separation distances and come to agreement on.
Any questions, Mr. Dunbar?
So actually, I do want to ask my question. It's not of you, Steve, I apologize, but to Chris and to Francis perhaps. Thinking about the way your amendment would work practically in this, on this map here, it looks like the I-2 zone limit kind of bifurcates some of the properties north of Terminal Road. And I'm wondering how this applies. If you put does it apply to the property or where the actual tank is? So, and does it apply to the whole property? So if you could put a tank, you go to a property that's partly in the partly within this limit, and then put the tank at the far side and not fall. Is that how your amendment would work?
The property lines, the lease lots, the ownership of property is all mixed up here. And so the standard is based on the location of the tank. If you're within 1,000 feet under Mr. Constant's amendment, and if you're within, under Mr. Constant's amendment, if you're in the I-2 zone, then a new tank in the I-2 zone would be a conditional use. And the I-2 zone is not based on a property line. It sort of follows the road, as you said, but then it cuts across. That's
So I guess my question then is to the jet, the exact location of your tank seems to kind of be an issue here, Like, could you conceivably put it just outside and avoid this conditional use process?
The first thing is that it's my understanding that even if a portion of our lot falls within this area, we're subject to the 1,000-foot rule. Is that correct?
It's the location of the tank.
Okay, so if it's a location of the tank, we don't really have much area without starting to crowd things. I mean, there's required setback by code. Time and time again, we've looked at this and we talked about it. The best location for us to be able to operate everything efficiently would be that back corner.
So there are kind of two back corners here.
Right.
One inside,
Which
one
back
outside.
corner are we talking?
Those are actually the corners that we would probably be looking at.
So you're talking, so could you, so you're talking about this corner and this corner, right?
The initial is right here on this one. So right as you come.
Do you own this lot as well?
Maybe not.
Oh, good.
There's wetlands, so we'd have to obviously look for mediation.
Can you hold that up and show it
Here.
Sorry, I don't know, I can't project it, but there are two different green spaces here, and they're talking about this one that just happens, unlucky for them, and probably didn't get discussed in Title 21, to be bifurcated by this yellow line, and that's where they want to put the new. Although it's it's significantly further away from Government Hill than a lot of the other tanks, but it still falls within the I-2 district.
And that's my question. All of the other boundaries of the I-2 districts follow roadways and natural boundaries. And for some reason on this map, the boundary of the I-2 zone deviates from the roadway natural boundary and encompasses part of the actual site of the industrial use. Why?
I can't speak to, the port has, the port has two zonings. A portion of it is marine industrial closest to the water, and a portion of it is I-2 closest to the neighborhood. That's just the zoning district boundary. Changing the zoning district boundary is a very significant thing. So that's not on the table here.
No, I understand that, but I just am curious why every other section on this map, how is it defined that zoning district cuts across into that property?
Mr. Consul, zoning, this is a common issue in Anchorage. This is not, specific to the port. We see this type of issue where we have split zone lines all over town. And to give you a good answer as to why it happens, unfortunately, the department won't be able to do that.
Anything else on that, Mr. Train? Okay, thank you.
Could I introduce this to the record?
Is that something new?
This is this new document where NFPA is deliberating internally the validity of the separation distances based on new science. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we have a picture of Seattle. Where this comes from?
The planning department.
Okay, did you want to discuss that?
Yeah, so I passed around a zoning map of Seattle. If you look at the blue, that's the industrial area. They have a marine industrial, and they have a heavy industrial, and they have a light industrial. Same as us. The light yellow, that's single-family neighborhoods. So the notion that other communities don't have single-family neighborhoods, single-family detached residential neighborhoods adjoining heavy industrial districts, every town seems to have it. Here's just an example of Seattle by their zoning map. Seattle makes fuel storage a permitted by right use. There's no 1,000-foot rule. There's no conditional use rule. Does Anchorage want to be more restrictive than Seattle? That's sort of the critical question. The Planning Department's position is the Building Safety Division reviews for building permits where fuel storage should be, and the old code matched the way Seattle and all these other cities that I've named treat fuel storage. It's this new code that creates the problem, and it was an unintended consequence of the new code.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, so some of the uses that we have conditional uses for. Conditional use is not unusual in the city, even around the border, in the port. We have assisted living homes, affiliated care, child care, instructional services, marijuana businesses, utility substations, movie theaters, gravel pits, cell towers. There are a lot of uses that are regulated under a conditional use process. And it is literally the baseline level of public input, public testimony. The public can have input on the administrative secretary by sending an email, but allowing people to stand up and speak to the point. And so these conditional uses happen all over this town in all corners. It's not unusual.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the map. So, sometimes often in our Community Economic Development Committee meetings, we may as a committee recommend a course of action. And I don't know if it's this sense, and I guess everybody's in play today. Something you'd want to do, or?
Personally, I don't think it's appropriate with a committee at home, because everybody's here to get the vote.
Right, okay, so we kind of hashed this out, and we had trouble with this when it was introduced at our Tuesday meeting, and this was a great discussion from everybody. So, we're done with comments, I think we can call it a meeting and then move on to Tuesday. Is that correct? Final point, Steve?
No, I just wanted to ask, was the public hearing closed at the last assembly meeting?
Yes.
All right, thank you. I wasn't certain.
Okay, anything else? So that makes this your last chance to vote.
Yeah, I do have one thing to say. This is my third meeting, and coming up on Tuesday, and I can't believe that I've grown as a brand new assembly member right into the middle of this 30-year battle. And to everybody who's kind of getting aside for my missteps that might happen along the way, I apologize. I was hired by my neighbors to stand up for them, and this is what they're asking for. So, just free on board.
Okay. All right, thank you, everybody. This was a good discussion, great information.